Chapter 26, Italy and Sicily in the 9th century, 827–924 by Charles Oman. Invasion of Sicily by the Moors, the western half of the island conquered, civil wars in southern Italy, the Moors invade Italy, Pope Leo's victory at Ostia, quarrels of the eastern and western churches, the false decretals, campaigns of the Emperor Louis Roman II. Against the Moors, anarchy in Italy after his death, the Byzantines reconquer southern Italy, the Moors in Campania, civil wars of Wido and Berengar, King Arnulf's invasion of Italy, long period of anarchy after his departure. On the fortunes of the Kingdom of Italy, that is, of the old Lombard realm, which had now become a province of the Empire of Charles the Great, we have already had occasion to touch on more than one occasion, but while northern Italy with its king established at Pavia, and central Italy with its pontiff and its turbulent Roman mob, have from time to time claimed our attention, we have had little necessity to mention the southern third of the peninsula, or the great island which faces it across the Straits of Messina. State of southern Italy. In the 9th century, the bulk of southern Italy, all those valleys of the Apennines, which had in ancient days bred the warlike Samnite race, was still in the hands of the Dukes of Benevento. We have mentioned that they had more than once been forced to pay homage to Charles the Great, but since his day, the empire had left the duchy alone. Two dukes, Cecco and Sicard, had held Benevento during the reign of Louis the Pious, and had to do with his son Lothair, the sub-king of Lombardy. Luckily for them, the heir of the empire was more set on maintaining a hold north of the Alps than on completing the Frankish supremacy in Italy. But it was not the whole of South Italy that the Beneventan dukes ruled. The East Roman emperors had never lost hold of the toe and heel of the peninsula, if we may use the familiar phrase that describes so well the shape of Italy. In Brindisi dwelt a strategos, whose authority extended over the southern part of the ancient Apulia. In Reggio another governor ruled the ancient land of Bruttium, now known by the name of Calabria. Beyond the Straits of Messina, a third military ruler had the hard task of preserving from the Saracen the half-lost theme of Sicily, where since 828 an unending struggle with the Moslem invader had been raging. Beside the Beneventan duchy and the Byzantine themes, there were yet more states in South Italy. Naples preserved a precarious independence under a series of hereditary consuls. It still paid a shadowy allegiance to the Eastern Empire, as did also the neighbouring Amalfi and Gaeta, which, like Naples, had never fallen into the hands of the Lombards. But these cities were rather allies than subjects of the Byzantines, and paid no obedience to the governors of the neighbouring themes. The one important element in the politics of southern Italy during the 9th century must be sought in the approaching peril of conquest by the Saracen. At first it was only the Byzantine possessions that were endangered, but very soon the whole of the Christian states were involved in the same trouble. The storm cloud from the south, which had threatened Constantinople in 720 and Gaul in 735, had now shifted its position. The new attack was in the centre, not on the eastern or the western flank of the line of defence of Christendom. For 20 years Italy was to be in deadly peril, and there appeared every prospect that Naples and Benevento, if not Rome also, would share the fate that had fallen on Carthage and Toledo 150 years before. The trouble began with the landing of a Mussulman army in Sicily during the year 827. They had been called in by a traitor named Euphemius, a termarch in the Sicilian theme, who rebelled against the Emperor Michael the Amorian. Euphemius rebels in Sicily, 827. Euphemius had carried off a nun from a convent, and the emperor had ordered the strategos of Sicily to punish him by cutting off his nose. But the soldier, instead of submitting, slew the governor, induced his troops to rebel, and seized Syracuse. His rising was put down by a fleet sent from Constantinople, but Euphemius himself escaped by sea, and took refuge with Ziad Itala, one of the Aglabite monarchs who ruled in northern Africa, since that land had shaken off its allegiance to the Caliph at Baghdad. Euphemius calls in the Moors. The Moor consented to lend Euphemius his aid, not in order to replace him on the Sicilian throne, but in the hope of winning Sicily for Islam and adding it to his own dominions. He proclaimed the Holy War, and named as General Ast ibn Foret, an aged doctor of law, who was worshipped as a saint by all Africa. The preaching of Ast gathered a multitude of fanatical adventurers, Arabs, Berbers, and Moors, to join the regular troops whom his master placed under his orders. Taking Euphemius with them, in the hope that the Sicilians would rise in his behalf, the Saracens landed at Mazara, on the south coast of the island early in June 827. The natives execrated the traitor and refused to join him, but when the strategos Fartinus led the army of Sicily against the invaders, he was completely defeated. The fanatical fury of the Mussulmans swept all before it. We are told that the aged Ast himself charged in the front rank in spite of his 70 years, and slew so many Christians that the clotted blood glued his lance to his hand. The army of Sicily was almost exterminated, and its commander fled to Calabria and died there. The Mussulmans then seized Girgenti and marched to besiege Syracuse, but before its walls, while they camped in the marshes of the Anapo, they were smitten by the same deadly marsh fever which has struck down so many other besiegers of that ancient city. Ast died of the pestilence, and his army fled from their plague-stricken camp, and fell back on Castrogiovanni, Enna, to which they laid siege. Here the traitor Euphemius fell, as he well deserved, himself the victim of treachery. He was tampering with the officers of the garrison, to induce them to surrender the place, when two brothers who pretended to listen to his offer enticed him to meet them under the walls, and promptly cut off his head when he came to the secret interview. The Moors repelled from Syracuse. The siege of Enna was soon afterwards raised by a force sent from Constantinople, and the Mussulmans fell back on the fort of Mineo, where they were beleaguered by the Byzantines. But just as victory seemed about to crown the East Romans' banners, the whole aspect of the war was suddenly changed by the arrival of two new Saracen hosts. A force dispatched by Ziad Itala to aid his first army fell upon Palermo and took it. A second force, composed of Moors of Spain, a band of exiles driven out of their own land by civil war, landed on the south coast, relieved their besieged Carolingianists at Mineo, and defeated the strategos of Sicily in the open field. For some time the Emperor Theophilus, who had just succeeded his father Michael on the Byzantine throne, continued to send succor to Sicily. But in 832 he became involved in a desperate war with the Caliph Martasim, which distracted all his attention to the east. This war in Asia proved the ruin of Sicily. The African Moors kept pouring in fresh fanatical hordes, and gradually subdued all the cities of the western half of the island. The Moors conquer East Sicily. For a moment it seemed likely that Sicily would be permanently divided between Greek and African, just as it had been 1200 years before, in the days of Dionysius and Hiero II, but at last the stubborn defence of the Byzantines was broken down by two fatal blows, the fall of Messina in 842, and that of Enna, the strongest post in the centre of the island, 17 years later, in 859. This drove the East Romans back to the eastern coast, where they retained no more than the sea-girt city of Syracuse and the strong towns about the roots of Mount Etna, Taormina, Catania and Rametta. The Moslems, masters of the bulk of the island, were now at leisure to turn their arms farther afield, and to cross the Straits of Messina to invade the mainland. In South Italy all the elements of disaster were ready and prepared. Sicard, Duke of Benevento, a ruffian and an oppressor, had been assassinated by his outraged subjects in 839. The Beneventans then proclaimed a certain Count Radulchis as their prince, but the important towns of Capua and Salerno adhered to Sicanulf, the brother of the deceased tyrant. A civil war broke out between these two pretenders, which was destined to last, with many variations of fortune, for no less than 12 years. In the second year of the struggle 840 Radulchis, hard pressed by his rival, had the unhappy inspiration of asking aid from the Moslems of Sicily. The chance was too good to be lost, and a Moorish army was landed at Bari, where it was received by the partisans of Radulchis, and allowed to take possession of the town. Then Sicanulf, as mad as his enemy, answered evil with evil by sending to Crete to call in to his aid the Saracen pirates of Candia. The Dukes of Benevento call in the Moors, 840. They came, and the same sight was seen which occurred 600 years later, when the rival emperors of Constantinople called in the Turks. The auxiliaries of each prince sacked the towns held by his rival, and generally ended by garrisoning them and holding them on their own account. Apulia and Lucania were overrun by the Moors and Cretans, while at the same moment the Sicilian Saracens crossed the straits. Messina had just fallen, and swept all over the Byzantine possessions in Calabria. Between 843 and the whole of Italy, from Reggio to the gates of Rome, was overrun by the Moslem marauders, and it seemed as if Christendom was to lose the southern part of the peninsula. Half its towns, Bari, Taranto, Reggio, Brindisi, even the castle of Misenum at the very gates of Naples, had now become Saracen fortresses. In 846 a great fleet from Africa appeared at Ostia, and the pirates overran the Roman Campagna, and even sacked the rich churches of St. Paul outside the walls and St. Peter on the Vatican. But for the solid ramparts of Aurelian, they would have entered the eternal city itself, and the town of Romulus and Gregory might have become a Moslem stronghold. But already the man to whom, above all others, Italy was to owe her salvation, had crossed the Alps and taken up his life's task. Louis, the eldest son of the unwise Emperor Lothair, was appointed king of Italy by his father in 844, soon after the partition of Verdun, and appeared in the next year before Sergius II to be solemnly crowned at Rome. The Pope made the young Frankish prince swear to protect the Church and all its privileges, but when once crowned, Louis made Sergius and all the nobles of Rome do him homage, and when in 847 Sergius died, and Leo IV followed him, the imperial rite of confirmation was duly acknowledged. Louis and Leo, who lived in Concord and Amity, were the first to discomfit the Saracens, and give some hope of salvation to Italian Christendom. In 849, the African and Sicilian Moslems sent a second and larger expedition against Rome. Pope Leo's victory at Ostia, 849. Pope Leo took the field himself with the forces of the Roman and Latin counts and barons, while the fleets of Naples and Amalfi, under the consul Caesarius, guarded the harbour of Ostia. When the infidels appeared, battle was joined at sea, but a tempest arose and drove most of the African fleet ashore. Caught between the Neapolitan ships and the Pope's army, the Moors were crushed. The few who escaped death by the sea and the sword became the slaves of the Romans, and were set to labour on the wall which Leo built to protect the Vatican and St. Peter's, the new quarter of Rome, which got from him the name of the Leonine city. The great fresco of Raphael representing this victory has made Pope Leo's triumph the 19th century event in Italy which is well remembered by the world. Louis II pacifies South Italy. In the next year the Emperor Louis compelled the rival Beneventan dukes to come to terms. He marched into Samnium and threatened to attack Resurgence if he refused to make peace with his enemy Sicanulf. Under this pressure a partition of the duchy was made. Resurgence kept the capital and the eastern half of the principality. Sicanulf became Prince of Salerno, and ruled the Campanian and Lucanian half. The conclusion of peace was celebrated by the massacre of the Saracen auxiliaries of Resurgence, whom the Duke quietly betrayed to the sword of Louis, now that he had no further need for their aid, 851. But though the civil war in South Italy was ended, the situation was still perilous. The whole coast from Bari to Reggio was still in the hands of the Moslems, who were coalescing into a single state under Mafar ibn Salim, the pirate king who governed Bari. He had taken the title of Sultan, and the majority of his countrymen had done homage to him. For 18 years, 853–71, he was the terror of South Italy, and might have founded a kingdom and a dynasty, if he had not been opposed by a warrior as active and obstinate as himself in the person of the Emperor Louis. The young Frankish Caesar was already making his power felt in Italy as neither his sire nor his grandsire had done. Unlike most of his race, he concentrated his mind on one kingdom and devoted himself to its defense. It resulted that he was an excellent ruler for Italy, but that he never gained such a footing beyond the Alps as he might have claimed in virtue of being the eldest heir of Charles the Great. Though a crowned emperor, he never reigned at Aachen, or held a foot of land outside the peninsula, except the single county of Provence. But in Italy his power was very real. He dealt most firmly with the papacy when Benedict III and Anastasius contested the papal throne in 855. The emperor's legate held a court of inquiry in the Lateran, and adjudged the former to be the true successor of St. Peter. Nicholas I, the next pontiff, was nominated by Louis in opposition to the majority of the Roman clergy. When he ventured to oppose his creator, he saw his city occupied by a Lombard army, and soon had to make his peace. Hadrian II, who followed Nicholas, was no less content to keep on good terms with the emperor, whom he praised as the sovereign who wars not, like other kings, against Christians, but only against the sons of Belial, the enemies of the Christian faith. Wherefore the hand of the Apostolic See will always be strong on the side of this most pious emperor, and the great dispenser of battles, through the intercession of the chief of the apostles, will ensure his triumph. Quarrel of Benedict and Photius. The success of Louis in keeping the papacy in hand was all the more notable because the three popes Benedict, Nicholas and Hadrian were all men of mark, who left their impress forever on the history of the Roman See. It was Benedict who began that quarrel with the Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, which brought about the final schism between the Eastern and the Western churches. Starting with a mere dispute as to the validity of the election of Photius, It was soon complicated by wrangles about the supremacy of the Roman See over the Illyrian and Macedonian bishoprics, a supremacy which had ceased to be real, since Leo the Isaurian had declared them to owe no obedience save to Constantinople. Benedict died in 858, but his successor Nicholas kept up the struggle with vigour, styling Photius an intruder and usurper, because his predecessor had never legally resigned the patriarchate, and finally declaring him deposed from his metropolitan throne. That one patriarch should venture to remove and excommunicate another without the aid of a general council, and merely in virtue of his power as the successor of Peter, appeared monstrous to the Byzantine clergy. They paid no attention to the letters of Nicholas, and the Emperor Michael the Drunkard threatened to make his arm felt in Italy, and to reclaim by the sword the right of the successor of Justinian over Rome. Breach between Eastern and Western churches. Nicholas replied by comparing the Byzantine ruler to Sennacherib, and by taunting him with the loss of Sicily and Calabria to the Saracens, which had deprived him of any opportunity of exercising his power west of the Adriatic. After 7 years of wrangling, the division between East and West was finally formulated by the Synod of Constantinople, 866, where the Patriarch, the Emperor, and 1,000 bishops and abbots drew up the 8 Articles, which declared the Roman Church to have departed from the Orthodox faith and discipline. 6 of the Articles only dealt with small ritual matters, such as the observance of Lent and the shaving of the clergy, but the 3rd, which denounced the enforced celibacy of the priesthood as a snare of Satan, and the 7th, which condemned the Roman doctrine as to the procession of the Holy Ghost, were all important. The Eastern Church now formally stated that the Western Church, by declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeded both from the Father and the Son, fell into a heresy so awful as to deserve 1,000 anathemas. Photius was soon afterwards deposed, but his fall did not heal the breach between the churches, for the Byzantine emperors and clergy all adhered to the statements of doctrine contained in the decree of the Synod of Constantinople. To this day they are held by the Eastern Church. Nicholas I was not only the pontiff who precipitated the quarrel with the Eastern Church, he will also be remembered as the protector of the injured Queen Teutberga, and the chastiser of the adulterous King Lothair of Lorraine, whose fortunes we have related in another chapter, the false decretals, but he has won his greatest fame from being the first pope who used the famous forged decretals. Up to his time, the collection of the letters and edicts of the bishops of Rome, which all the Church knew and used, extended no further back than those of Siricius. But there was brought to Rome about the year 860 a collection of 59 decretals, which purported to be those of the popes of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and 39 more which were interpolated among the real documents extending from Siricius down to Gregory II. 380-4731. There was also in this precious collection the celebrated donation of Constantine and the acts of several councils. This wonderful series of documents, it was said, had been discovered in Spain by Riculf, Archbishop of Mainz. It was at once incorporated in the authentic series of Acts of Councils, edited by the great Isidore of Seville, and the new as well as the old documents were in future called by his name. To anyone with a competent knowledge of early church history, or with a turn for textual criticism, the false decretals would have betrayed their character at once. But these accomplishments were rare in the 9th century, and the few who could have exposed the new decretals were precisely the persons most interested in proving them to be authentic. For, as was natural considering their origin, they were full of authoritative decisions on the points in which the 9th century clergy were interested. What could be more delightful than to find St. Clement or St. Felix giving just such decisions on the questions of church lands or clerical celibacy as would have been given by the reigning pontiff? To inquire whether the church had any lands in the 1st century, or whether the idea of clerical celibacy had then been broached, would have been not only impious but unwise. Influence of the false decretals. So the false decretals, with all their anachronisms and confusions of persons and impossibilities of style and form, were greedily swallowed by the Pope and the whole clerical body, and promptly turned into weapons of war against the civil power, the Eastern Church, and any other enemy for whose discomfiture they were suited. It is impossible not to suppose that Nicholas I knew what he was doing in accepting the decretals. He had in his own hands the genuine decrees of the Pope's fro, preserved with care and accuracy. How was it possible that more should exist in a corner of Spain than in the papal chancery, with the most important title deeds of the Roman See, which proved that from the days of the apostles downward, the popes had exercised the power of legislating for the whole Western Church, have been suffered to pass into oblivion? On such points, Nicholas must have had his own views, but the documents were too tempting to be neglected, and from henceforward they were freely used as a basis for the monstrous claims of the medieval papacy. Who forged the pseudo-Isidorian decretals we shall never know. They were first heard of at Mainz, and it would seem that it was either at Mainz or at Rheims that they were composed. Rome, though she used them, did not have the shame of framing them. Indeed, they were originally intended to serve the ends of the local bishops rather than those of the Pope. The first time that they were used in a case of importance was in 866. Hincmar, Archbishop of Rheims, had deposed Rothard, Bishop of Soissons, for incompetence. Rothard appealed to Nicholas I, on the plea that according to the decretals the power of deposing a bishop lay with the Pope alone, and not with the Archbishop. Nicholas then restored the Bishop of Soissons to his see to the great wrath of Hincmar, who would have repudiated the decretals, but for the unfortunate fact that he himself had used them in the previous year. He had to content himself with the cautious saying that the documents were a mousetrap for archbishops, circumposita omnibus metropolitanis mausipula, because they threw all power into the hands of the Roman pontiff. But we must return to the secular affairs of Italy. In 853, the Emperor Louis made the first of his attempts to expel the Saracens from the peninsula. It failed owing to the slackness or treachery of the Duke of Benevento, who bought a private peace for himself from the Sultan of Bari, and rejoiced to see the worst of the Moslem raids turned off against his neighbours of Salerno. Naples also long remembered the day when Maferg forced his way to its very gates, and sat in triumph on a heap of corpses by the bank of the Sebedo, while his soldiery laid the heads of their victims at his feet. Success of Louis II. Over the Moors, 867–875. Some years later Louis began a second series of campaigns against the infidel. At first he met with many checks, but in 867 he forced the Dukes of Benevento and Salerno to do him homage and to join his Lombards in the field. He took one after another many of the towns of Apulia, and at last in 868 laid siege to Bari itself. The leaguer lasted no less than 3 years, but while it was in progress Louis was clearing Lucania and Calabria of the enemy. Yet as long as the sea was open Bari never failed to obtain provisions and reinforcements, and Louis was forced to find some naval power to back him. He asked the aid of the Emperor Basil the Macedonian, who had just succeeded Michael the Drunkard on the Byzantine throne. Accordingly, the Admiral Neistas Oriphas swept the Adriatic with 100 ships and drove the Moslems out of its recesses. He then blockaded Bari for a space, but soon quarrelled with Louis and withdrew. The Sultan, however, deprived of the command of the sea, had been driven to extremity, and in February 871 the Emperor succeeded, even without Byzantine aid, in storming the city. The garrison was put to the sword, all save the Sultan, whom Duke Adelgis of Benevento had captured in the citadel. Louis now turned to seize Taranto, the last Saracen stronghold in Apulia, and spoke of completing his work by clearing Calabria and attacking Sicily. But treachery frustrated this grand and salutary scheme. Louis kidnapped by Duke Adelgis, while the emperor was paying a visit to Benevento, in company with his wife and daughter. The new Duke Adelgis treacherously seized him and threw him into a dungeon. The traitor is said to have been persuaded by his prisoner, the Sultan of Bari, that the further success of Louis would mean the annexation of all Italy to the imperial domain, and the extinction of all the southern principalities of the peninsula. But punishment was at hand. On the news of the fall of Bari, the Aglabite monarch in Africa had resolved that Italy should not be lost to Islam, and had prepared a vast expedition against southern Christendom. Duke Adelgis had only kept his suzerain 40 days in bonds, when he heard to his dismay that 30,000 Moors under a general named Abdallah, who styled himself the Wali of Italy, had landed at Taranto. In terror at this approaching storm, the Duke liberated his august prisoner, after making him swear to bear no rancour for his captivity. It was felt that Louis alone could save Italy, and the armies of the Lombards would be needed to drive out the African. Meanwhile, the Wali Abdallah laid siege to Salerno, which its Duke Wafer defended with great courage. The moment that he was released, the emperor summoned the hosts of northern Italy to Rome. They mustered in great strength, eager to avenge Louis on the treacherous duke, and Pope Hadrian II at once declared the oath that had been sworn at Benevento null and void, because extorted by force. Louis routs the Moors, 872. But before punishing the traitor, Louis was magnanimous enough to resolve to drive away the Moors who lay before Salerno. His vanguard under Count Gunther defeated near Capua, the covering army with which the besiegers were protecting their main operation. Then the emperor himself came down on the Moorish camp. After a short struggle, the invaders fled to their ships. A tempest swept down on them ere they had well got out to sea, and the whole armament was engulfed. Aug. 872. It was now time to deal with the traitor Duke of Benevento. In the spring of 873, Louis, supported by the solemn blessing of Pope John Roman VIII, marched into the duchy, overran it, and forced his way to the gates of the capital. But his successful campaign did not end, as might have been expected, by the annexation of Adelgi's dominions. At the intercession of the Pope, the Duke was admitted to pardon, and on doing homage and penance was reinvested with the sovereignty of Benevento. Louis had now leisure to undertake his great scheme for expelling the Moors from Calabria and Sicily. Death of Louis, 875, but to the grief of all his subjects, and the eternal misfortune of Italy, he died in 875. To crown the disaster, he left no male heir, but only a daughter, and the Princess Hermingard was not yet married to any stalwart count who could have championed her claim to her father's realm. Louis was by far the best of the later Carlings. Just, pious, and forgiving like his grandfather and namesake, he was no weakling as the elder Louis had been, but a mighty man of war from his youth up. If he had succeeded his father Lothar in all his kingdoms, the fall of the empire of the Franks would have been stayed for another generation. If he had lived longer and left male issue, a strong and compact kingdom of Italy would probably have come into being. But when they bore him to rest in the old Basilica of St. Ambrose at Milan, the hope of a united Italy was buried in his grave, and the Age of Iron, as it was afterwards styled, set in for all the provinces of the peninsula. We have narrated in another chapter the troubles which were brought upon Italy, and all the other kingdoms of the Frankish Empire, by the extinction of the eldest line of the descendants of Charles the Great, and the vacancy of the imperial throne. Charles the Bold became the nominal successor of Louis II, but while he was absent in Neustria, the Saracens, recovering from their fearful defeat of 872, began once more to infest Apulia and Campania. They thrice defeated Adelgis of Benevento in the open field, and it was in vain that he and Pope John joined to beg Charles the Bold to return and deliver the c. 433. Deliverance, however, came not from the west but from the east. While the Frankish emperor failed to appear, Basil the Macedonian had resolved to take up the task of driving the Moors from Italy. His armies crossed the Ionian Sea and seized Bari in 875. They met with unbroken success. The Apulian towns opened their gates one after another in order to get succor from the infidel. The Byzantines conquer South Italy, 875–94. Two splendid naval victories annihilated for a space the piratical fleets of the African and Sicilian Moors. Their stronghold of Taranto was stormed, and then in 3 years, the great general Nicephorus Phocas, grandfather of the emperor of the same name, overran Calabria, and left not a single Saracen on the eastern side of Italy, 884–87. The Byzantines then went on to attack the Duchy of Benevento. They swept over it with ease, and forced Duke Urso to fly into exile. For 4 years East Roman governors ruled at Benevento itself, but in 894 Wido, king of Italy, drove them out of that city, and reconstituted the Beneventan state on a smaller scale. Its southeastern half, the provinces which got from the Greeks the names of the Basilicata and Catapenata, remained permanently in the hands of the Eastern Emperor. It is strange to find that while the Byzantines were faring so well in Italy, their fate in Sicily had been disastrous, unless, indeed, it was success in one quarter that led to the neglect of the other. In 877, a great horde of African and Sicilian Moslems laid siege to Syracuse, the main post of the Estromans in the island. It was defended stubbornly by 2 forgotten worthies, John the Patrician and Nistus of Tarsus, and held out for 10 months. Syracuse taken by the Moors, 877. By May 878, the besieged were reduced to feed on grass, nettles, and unclean animals, and the fainting troops could no longer man the walls. The Moors burst in, and massacred the patrician and the remains of the gallant garrison. Nothing now remained to the empire in Sicily, save a few forts among the roots of Etna and the single town of Catania. These were held throughout the war, and only fell in the beginning of the next century. While the Byzantines were maintaining their struggle in South Italy and Sicily with the Aglabite monarchs of the Moors, Lombardy and Rome had troubles of their own. Much vexed by Saracen inroads on Campania, Pope John Roman VIII summoned Charles the Bold to return to Italy. the king of Neustria, did for once appear to vindicate his imperial claims in 877, but it was only to fly in haste and to expire while crossing the pass of Mont Cenis. The title of emperor and the kingdom of Lombardy were both now vacant. Several princes stepped forward to claim them. The majority of the North Italians, headed by the Bishop of Milan, chose to rule them. Carloman, the eldest son of Louis the German, though the Pope tried to support the claims of Count Boso, a Burgundian noble who had just married the Princess Hermingard, the heiress of the good Emperor Louis II. But Carloman never was able to make good his rule over Lombardy. Soon after his election he lost his health and fell into a lethargy, which obliged him to abandon all state affairs. Yet till his death in 880 he held the title of King of Italy. Meanwhile the peninsula fared very ill without the hand of a ruler to guide it. While the East Roman armies were evicting the Moors from the Adriatic shore, the expelled infidels kept throwing themselves upon Latium and Campania. Aided by new swarms from Africa, they infested the regions about Naples, Capua and Gaeta, till in despair the Neapolitan Republic made a private peace with them, and bought immunity from their ravages by allowing its harbour to become a base of operations for the plunder of the neighbouring lands. The Moors in Campania, a veritable colony of Mohammedans, was soon established on the banks of the Garigliano, and Froti, the central Italian powers, were quite unable to drive them out. Their ravages extended far and wide into the Samnite Apennines, and even as far as Tuscany. Yet, strangely enough, the adventurers never succeeded in capturing Gaeta or Capua or any other of the strong towns around them. They were purely predatory, and showed no signs of settling down into an organized state. In his despairing search for an emperor who should save Rome and Italy, Pope John finally crowned Charles the Fat, the most unpromising candidate upon whom he could possibly have pitched. But the incapable and unwieldy monarch soon returned to Germany, and even took with him for northern wars the Lombard levies which John had fondly hoped to use for the extirpation of the Campanian Moslems, 881. Next year John VIII died. He was the last of those able pontiffs of the 9th century who did their best to defend Italy from the infidel, and to strengthen and extend the papal power over the Frankish kings and the Frankish Church. After his decease, the same blight which had already fallen on the house of Charles the Great seemed to descend on the bearers of the Roman keys. 3 popes died in 8 years, and men of mark ceased to appear on the papal throne. The last 15 years of the century saw the first of those scandalous prelates who were for a century to be the disgrace of Christendom. The inglorious reign of Charles the Fat was no less fatal to Italy than to the rest of the Frankish realms. The Moors of Sicily and their colonists on the Garigliano sent their expeditions farther and farther afield. Their vessels were seen as far north as Pisa and Genoa. The Moors of Fraxinet, 888-975, another band from Spain, descended on the Provençal coast at the same moment, and seized the sea-girt fortress of Fraxinet, where they established a strong colony, which lasted nearly 100 years, 880-975. The raids of the Moors of Fraxinet reached far inland, in despite of the kings of Arles and Upper Burgundy. We read, to our surprise, of incursions which devastated the whole valley of the Rhone, and reached as far as Lausanne and St. Maurice in Switzerland. On one occasion a band of Provençal Saracens and a band of Magyars from the Danube met, and fought at Orbe in the land of Vaud. It seemed as if the enemies of Europe had met at her central point, and that Christendom was doomed to succumb. After the deposition of Charles the Fat, no more Carlings of legitimate blood survived. Italy, like the other Frankish realms, had to seek a new royal house. 2 princes courted the suffrages of the Lombard Diet and the blessing of the Pope, Wido, Duke of Spoleto, the most powerful and the most turbulent of the nobles of central Italy, and Berengar, Margrave of the March of Friuli, the Italian borderland toward the Slavs of Illyria. Both claimed Carling blood on the Spindle side. Berengar was the son of Gisela, a daughter of Louis the Pious and the Empress Judith. Wido's mother was a daughter of Lothair I, and a sister of the good Emperor Louis II. At first there appeared some chance that the 2 competitors might not come to blows, for Wido had the bold idea of crossing the Alps to seize the Lotharingian dominions of his grandfather Lothair, in the general breakup of the empire which followed the deposition of Charles the Fat. He agreed to allow Berengar to be crowned King of Italy if he himself was aided in his transalpine schemes. The Margrave of Friuli, therefore, was duly elected by the Lombard Diet and anointed king by the Archbishop of Milan, while Duke Wido entered Burgundy and got himself crowned at Langres. Wars of Wido and Berengar. But after a short struggle with Odo of France, the Spoltan prince abandoned his hopes beyond the Alps and fell back on Italy. Then, disregarding the oaths he had sworn to Berengar, he commenced to intrigue with the counts of central Italy, and soon laid claim to the crown. There followed 4 years of bitter war between Berengar and Wido, the former supported by Lombardy, the latter by Tuscany and all central Italy, and backed by the Pope, pretending that the Archbishop of Milan ought not to have crowned Berengar, the privilege belonging to the papal see alone. Stephen V anointed Wido, and proclaimed him emperor as well as king of Italy 891. The struggle between the rival kings ended in the victory of Wido, who took Pavia, drove Berengar back into his own duchy of Friuli, and ruled all the Lombard realm for 3 years. He made Pope Formosus crown his son Lambert as co-regent emperor with him, and thought that his dynasty was firmly established. Arnulf invades Italy, 894. The humbled Berengar sent over the Alps to ask aid from Arnulf, king of Germany. That prince had always claimed the primacy among the various rulers who now shared the empire of Charles the Great between them, and was only too glad of an opportunity to interfere in Italy. He crossed the Alps in 894, was joined by Berengar, and laid siege to Bergamo, the strong cliff-built city which dominates the Lombard plains from the last spur of the Alps. The Germans stormed the town, and Arnulf hung Count Ambrosius, the governor, in his armor before the gate, after massacring the whole garrison. The terror of this deed cowed the partisans of Wido, and all Italy north of the Po did homage to Arnulf. The Spoltan emperor retired southward to prepare to defend the line of the Apennines. There he died, leaving his claims to his son Lambert. Next year Arnulf returned in force, passed triumphantly through Tuscany, and though disease much thinned the ranks of his army, appeared before the walls of Rome. Not Lambert of Spoleto but his mother Engeltrud defended the Eternal City. Arnulf takes Rome, 895. Inspirited by her the Romans held out for some days, but when Arnulf had stormed the Leonine city, the new quarter beyond the Tiber, the empress and her warriors fled, and the Pope opened the gates. Formosus, who had always opposed the Spoltans, looked on Arnulf as a deliverer and crowned him emperor with joy. But the violence and rapine of the conquering soldiery disgusted the populace of Rome, whose confidence had not been won by Arnulf's first act, the beheading of 30 citizens who had favoured the cause of Wido and Lambert. Attacked by fever and a paralytic stroke, Arnulf returned to Germany without having conquered Lambert's hereditary duchy in the Umbrian Apennines. The moment he was gone, all central Italy rose in favour of the Spoltan. Pope Formosus, Arnulf's chief supporter, died at this moment, and the new Pope, Stephen VI, a rabid supporter of the faction of Lambert, violated his predecessor's sepulchre, declared him an antipope and usurper, and cast his corpse into the Tiber, 896. Arnulf, stricken down by disease, returned no more to Italy, and in his absence Berengar of Friuli once more became master of Lombardy, while Lambert of Spoleto was acknowledged in Rome, Tuscany and Umbria. Berengar sole king of Italy 900. Fortunately for Italy, Lambert died 18 months later, killed by a fall from his horse, and his mother Engeltrud sent to Berengar to recognize him as sole king, making no claim in behalf of her young grandchild, the son of Lambert. Arnulf died a year later, and thus in the last year of the century 900, Berengar was left without competitors. That his reign was not likely to be happy may be gathered from the preceding pages. The Saracens of Campania were still in the field. A new scourge, the Magyars from the Danube, appeared for the first time in Italy in 899, and raided as far as Verona, showing by their brutal cruelty that Christendom might have even worse foes than the Moslem. Rome meanwhile was a prey to anarchy. 6 popes died in 4 years, nor was their loss much to be deplored. Boniface VII had been twice deposed from the priesthood for profligacy. For Stephen VI, who showed his disposition by his horrid treatment of the corpse of Formosus, we need not much grieve, when we read that his enemies caught him and strangled him in prison. Of the other popes, creatures of a few months' reign, we know so little that it is hard to take any interest in their fate. They represented nothing more than parties among the citizens of Rome or the barons of Latium. So closed the 9th century, with prospects as black for Italy as for the other kingdoms which 100 years before had joined in saluting Charles the Great as emperor. The only favourable point in the outlook was the hope that a national Lombard kingship might be once more restored in the person of Berengar. It was the unfortunate connection between the Pope, the Italian crown, and the imperial title that was still to be Berengar's bane. He had hardly reigned a year in peace 900, when Pope Benedict Roman IV and the remains of the party of Lambert of Spoleto found a new competitor to pit against him. This was Louis, King of Provence or Arles, the son of King Boso and the Italian Princess Hermingard, and therefore the grandson of the good Emperor Louis Roman II. Louis won several successes over Berengar, was crowned King of Lombardy at Pavia, and then received the imperial crown at Rome in February 901, but he could not permanently hold his own. After a year's fighting, Berengar succeeded in chasing him beyond the Alps. Berengar conquers the Moors. He returned in 905, again called in by the rebellious counts of central Italy, and once more won some fleeting advantages over the native king of the land. But as he lay in Verona, he was suddenly surrounded by an army of Berengar's partisans. The citizens of the place threw open the gates at night, and the young Provençal emperor fell into his rival's hands. Berengar bade his servants blind the captive, and sent him back in sorry plight to abide in his kingdom by the Rhone. And so at last he firmly held the Italian crown, which had cost so many princes their lives. But it was only a precarious empire over the Lombard plain that Berengar enjoyed. The Pope and the counts of central Italy, even when they did not raise up any rival against him, systematically set his commands at naught. The imperial title he either did not covet or could not obtain from the Pope, till in 915 John X bought his support against the Saracens of the Garigliano by conferring on him the long-withheld dignity. In the following year Italy was happily relieved from that band of marauders. The troops of Berengar, of the Dukes of Spoleto and Benevento, and of the Pope were all for once united in the Holy War, and when united they proved invincible. The forts of the Mussulmans were stormed, their armies beaten in the field, and the whole colony finally rooted out. But after this triumph Berengar was not fated to die in peace. In his old age his enemies stirred up against him yet another king from beyond the Alps, Rudolf II, of Upper Burgundy. Berengar was once more deserted by many of his followers, and once more saw the greater part of Lombardy overrun by a Transalpine army. Death of Berengar 924. But this time he was not destined to survive his troubles. While besieged in Verona in the year 924, he was murdered by traitors, and lost his life, as well as the royal and imperial crown, for which he had so often contended.